Hello, bonjour, merhaba, salam. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science, and I have the real privilege of being the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LERRN is a partnership between researchers, civil society partners, and refugee leaders in Canada and around the world, especially focused on the needs and opportunities identified by our working groups in East Africa and the Middle East. Through research, training, capacity sharing, policy engagement, and public dialogue, we're working to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in refugee responses, especially in pursuit of protection and solutions, both with and for refugees. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I live and work is the unceded land of the Algonquin Nation. And I say that not only out of respect, but out of a recognition of my occupation of land here in Canada, but also in recognition of the fact that these questions of dispossession, dislocation, power, and agency that we discuss today are also part of the history of the land on which I live and work. And with that, let me say how thrilled I am to be welcoming so many participants for this webinar today. We have over 200 attendees who've registered for this webinar, and I see that more are joining every minute. Today, we are hearing from the team that has been undertaking very innovative and timely research on the role of refugee-led organizations and initiatives in 3 countries in the Middle East: Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. As the team will share, this research is intended to inform both policy and practice in future research on the role of refugee-led organizations as part of broader refugee responses and the broader refugee response system. It's incredibly timely, given the upcoming Global Refugee Forum in December 2023 and broader discussions on localization. The motivation for this research dates back to the early days of the COVID pandemic, when international actors were limited in their mobility and access. It was a time when light was very clearly shone on what refugees have always done, which is for refugees themselves to organize and be at the front line of responding to the needs of the communities in which they live and work. These reflections were published as part of a blog for the Calder Center in April 2020, and the link to that blog will appear in the chat box in a moment. It was also echoed in research on refugee-led responses in East Africa, published by colleagues at Oxford's Refugee Studies Center, and also research on the norm, the emergence of a norm of refugee participation at a global level. And this led to discussions with the Open Society Foundations, the Bosch Foundation, Canada's International Development Research Centre, the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, and the Global Whole Being Fund on the need for comparative research on the nature of refugee-led organizations, the scope of this work, and the factors that condition their impact between 2 regions. We're very grateful for the support that we've received from those partners to make this research possible. But let me stress, it wasn't just a question of conducting research, but to conduct research in a way that was different, that was able to situate these regions from the perspectives of those who are closest to the phenomenon of displacement. So it wasn't partners from outside of the region conducting this work, it was partners who were not only within the region, but in very close proximity to this phenomenon. The results are tremendously exciting, and we're really thankful for our partners in making this work possible and in bringing this research to you. So today's webinar is the launch of the summary of results of the Middle East research team. The executive summary of this research is now available online, and the link will appear magically in the chat box in a moment. The full report will be available on our website in the coming weeks. So those of you who have registered for this webinar, you will receive a report, a link to the recording, and that will include a link to a page that includes the full report. This research can very usefully be read in comparison with the results of a parallel research project in East Africa, undertaken in close partnership with the Refugee-led Research Hub in Nairobi, and with the reports available on their website. So we're really honored to have worked very closely with the Center for Lebanese Studies in facilitating this research, just as we're so grateful to the research team for their tremendous work. This simply would not have been possible without the leadership of the individuals who are sharing the research today and the amazing colleagues at the Center for Lebanese Studies. But before I introduce them, let me share some practicalities for this webinar to enhance your viewing experience. First, please note that the webinar is being supported by interpretation in Arabic and in Farsi. To access interpretation, go to the bottom of your screen, look for the globe that says interpretation, click on the globe, and select the language of your choice. Second, please note that this webinar is in the view-only format. So please use the Q&A box. I see someone has already posted something in the Q&A box. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to pose questions. I will curate those questions and pose them to the speakers in the second half of the webinar. Please be respectful in posing of questions in the Q&A box. Inappropriate behavior or the use of hateful or hurtful language will lead to your removal from this webinar. Third, if you have any technical questions or concerns during the webinar, please send an email to learn@carleton.ca with any questions that you may have. You can also use the website for Zoom. It has good conversations there. Fourth, if you are on social media, please feel free to join the conversation online by tagging @learning, and please do feel free to follow us on Twitter. And this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on LERRN's website with a link being sent to everyone who is registered for this webinar. And finally, you will receive a survey at the end of this webinar. Please take some time to answer that survey so that we can improve our hosting of webinars in the future. And we hope you enjoy this webinar. I hope you enjoy it and learn as much as I have learned in working so closely with the team over these past 18 months or so. So full bios for the speakers and for the discussants are available on the website, and the link to the bios will be posted soon as Urub is preparing to launch the presentation. Let me just say quick words of introduction. Let me just say how delighted I am to welcome Dr. Urub El-Abed. And Urub, if you go down to the bottom of the screen and see the screen and click on that, that will launch the presentation. Thank you. We're delighted to have Dr. Urub El-Abed. She's a longtime friend, partner, and a collaborator of LERRN, someone from whom I have learned a great deal in the last 4 or 5 years. She's a senior researcher at the Center for Lebanese Studies in Jordan and was the fearless regional research coordinator for this project. She's joined by Farah Al-Hamouri, the lead country researcher in Jordan, Mustafa Hoshmand, who is the lead country researcher in Turkey, and Watfa Najdi, who's the lead country researcher in Lebanon. They'll present their research in just a moment. We will then benefit from the insight of 2 discussants who will offer comments after the presentation. Miriam Aslan is the country director of Oxfam Netherlands and also the manager of the Refugee Council of Turkey. And Yara Murad is the assistant director of the Refugee Research and Policy Program. She's the program manager of that at the Assam Forest Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University in Beirut. After we hear from them, we'll hear from Anna Belen with UNHCR working in the region before we open the floor for comments and questions from the audience. So again, please use that Q&A function. I'll be curating these contributions and moderating the discussion that follows. So with that, let me give the floor to the research team. and pass the floor to you, Urub. Urub, I would note that we can see the notes version of the presentation, not the presentation version. So if you'd like to exit from the view that you have and either press F5 on your keyboard or click on the screen icon in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you'll be able to see the presentation. We see it now. Urub, over to you, please.
Brilliant. Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for being that many interested in our work. Thanks, James, for this introduction, and thanks for introducing us as a team. In turn, I feel I need to introduce Professor James Milner, not only as a founder of LERRN, not only as a moderator of this session, but as the principal investigator of this project who supported us to secure the funding from the esteemed private donors mentioned earlier by James. Over the last 18 months, James has overseen the research progress in the Middle East and has provided us with academic and theoretical support, which has been highly valued. So thank you, James. We cannot really start our talk and our discussion before we express our gratitude and our thanks to the refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Turkey. Those who have given us of their time and shared with us their experiences about coming together as a community and about creating their own refugee-led organizations. We made sure that we invite them to this talk, today's talks. So thank you for being with us and thank you for sharing your experiences with us. Our research on refugee-led organizations, what we call RLOs of the Middle East, is an evidence-based study that aimed to analyze the important role of the localized humanitarian support led by refugees. In a region that has hosted refugees for many decades, supporting refugee mobilization is not really a new concept. Jordan and Lebanon have both hosted for many years Palestinian mobilization in and outside refugee camps, nurturing cultural, socio-political, and economic activities. Building on this past, this work focuses on the role that has been played by refugee communities to respond to the needs of refugees and to fulfill gaps in services and protection. This has been in tandem with the localization of aid agenda, which advocated for strengthening local humanitarian actors. This was presented in the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain of the very same year. The argument about the localization of aid is that it emphasized the potential of local capital and local knowledge to enhance the effectiveness of the humanitarian response. The 2018 Global Refugee Compact has placed an emphasis on enhancing refugee self-reliance and recognizing the value of refugee participation in decision-making. In our research, we sought to understand the nature and scope of refugee-led responses. We questioned the opportunities and constraints, including local, national, and international policies that shape the work of refugee-led responses. We were inquisitive about the impact of such responses, whether at a big scale or small scale, on refugee communities. And we examined best practices from RLOs and empirical mechanisms to reduce the barriers that affect their mobilization. We sought to situate the various structures and patterns of RLOs, which you will be hearing about from my colleagues today, in the wider ecosystem. That is the policies of host states and of international politics towards refugees and their created structures in order to understand the role they were able to assume as effective providers. We aim to understand different structures, strategies, and levels of formality that have shaped the work agenda and the local dynamics in the inter-level of the RLO and at the intra-level of the RLOs with host states, with host societies, and at the transnational level. Our study covered 3 countries: Jordan, where we studied Syrian refugees, Iraqis, Yemenis, Somali, Sudanese, and not to forget Palestinian refugees. By Palestinians, we meant those who are not holders of the Jordanian nationality. And we focused in 4 cities, which are Mafraq and El-Abed up in the north of the country, Jerash, that is known for the Gaza concentration, Gaza, Palestinian, Gaza, ex-Gazan refugees, and Amman, the capital. In Lebanon, we studied Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees in and outside refugee camps, some Iraqis in Beirut, and in border cities of Baalbek and Tripoli. In Turkey, we studied Syrians, Afghani, Persians, Yemenis, Iraqis, and some Palestinians. In Istanbul, in Kayseri, in Trabzon, and Hatay. The literature review we did at the very beginning of our research work permitted us to engage with the paucity of literature written on RLOs as such in this region. Yet the desktop research indicated for us the refugee nationalities and their proportional distribution in different cities of the 3 countries we studied. That equipped us to conduct virtual mapping with the main actors through online consultations and physical visits to the identified cities in order to understand the local dynamics. The mapping phase was a very important phase in this research, since it permitted us to search all actors in all targeted cities, whether officially registered or working in the shade, whether officially registered bodies or the small ones working in the shade, working at a very small scale. From the mapped RLOs, we selected, based on a SAT criteria, between 25 to 30 RLOs, refugee-led organizations, to conduct face-to-face interviews, either with their leaders or with their active members and beneficiaries. After the analysis of the collected interviews, we held discussions with stakeholders, with INGOs, with UN bodies, and with some local NGOs. The team was composed of 2 groups, what we called RRs, refugee researchers, where we were keen in this research to work with refugees and to engage them in our research without jeopardizing their well-being, their safety, and without exposing them to any harm as working illegally in a closed profession. The academic team, the academic and research team, my colleagues who are today with me, is composed of researchers with extensive forced migration experience. I'm going to start with myself so that I pass on to the others. I am a 3rd-generation Palestinian refugee, holder of a Jordanian nationality. I have not experienced displacement, but I have researched, taught, and written lots on forced migration in the Middle East. My colleague Mustafa Hoshmand, who is our Turkey research coordinator, had a displacement experience himself in Iran, fleeing the danger from Afghanistan before living in Turkey, living and studying and working in Turkey with refugees. Farah Al-Hamouri is our Jordan research coordinator with masters in social work and forced migration. And I am handing over to my colleague Watfa Najdi, who's our Lebanon research coordinator. She is an architect herself and is a researcher on urban refugees. Watfa, floor is yours.
Thank you, Aru. Okay, so with that and moving forward from the methodology that Aru just described, the team together mapped several RLOs that varied in their shapes, forms. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yes, no, the slide before that. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying, the team mapped several RLOs that varied in their shapes, forms, sizes, and agendas depending on the needs of the community, the concentration or dispersal of their
و
community
البته
members.
بسته به در واقع
In
نیازمندی
addition to
هایی
the
که
ability
در
of
واقع جامعه
RLOs
وجود
to
داره.
liaise with established humanitarian aid organizations. So despite being present and active in different shapes and forms, a defining feature of an RLO remained the role of refugees in the organization's leadership and decision-making process. So this informed the development of the following definition of an RLO in our region. As you can see on the screen, an RLO is an organized, formal or informal response initiated, led, or managed by a forcibly displaced person to provide the community with humanitarian, socioeconomic, cultural, and/or protection services. This definition covers the wide spectrum of RLOs, from grassroots and small-scale, sometimes unregistered organizations, to registered, large-scale, and more visible organizations. The definition also reflects our findings that these RLOs often build on existing social networks between people of the same religion, sect, ethnicity, nationality, or profession, and are often influenced by a set of local, national, and international policies and conditions. So in other words, and in order to better understand the various shapes and forms or mobilization patterns of RLOs, we have attempted to break it down to layers. The layers you can see on the screen illustrate how RLO action can take shape in particular ways in response to availability of funding, legal status, community mobilization structures, and access to local and international networks. These factors will be discussed in more details later on by Farah and Mustafa, my colleagues. So we identified, back to the layers, we identified 4 different layers of RLO action. I'm going to start from the bottom up. So the 4th layer, which represents the organic self-help structures or interventions that are often led by philanthropic individual initiatives. It represents the action usually taken by a single person or a group of people from the community who have identified a particular need and have organized themselves to respond to this need. These people are usually more comfortable financially or have more networks that enable them to attain this, to provide this help to their community. Layer 3, which is the community mobilization. This is when this group or a refugee leader or group of leaders mobilize, bringing together members of their community through networking and reaching out to have a wider outreach, capitalizing on funds and support from local actors. Layer 2 is the institutionalization of community mobilization. So this is when refugee mobilization is institutionalized, as in it becomes established and registered as an organization or as a profit company or a social enterprise or as an association in the host country, depending on the policies of this host country. This process facilitates the organization's ability to attract external funding and enables RLOs to broaden the community that they serve. The first layer is the transnational organizations. So this is when RLOs have reached the capacity to work across borders and mobilize their transnational network with refugees in exile and in the diaspora. This represents the ability of refugees to widen their scope of services, increase the size of communities that they can reach, diversify their networks, and reach out to funders and international actors. So according to these layers or these different typologies, we disaggregated the different RLOs in each of the countries. So what you can see on the screen is a table that shows a difference or a variety in numbers according to the different countries and the different layers that we've identified. And this difference in numbers is going to be further explained by my colleague Farah, who's going to refer to the equation that we adopted on agency. On to you, Farah.
Thank you, Watfa.
Yeah, thank you. It is this refugee agency equation that we analyze. Why, when, and how do refugees establish their RLOs? Refugee agency facilitates the establishment of refugee-led responses. It's attributed to the presence of capacity, the reason to act, or a common concern, and most importantly, a high level of social capital. Agency is also influenced by political, institutional, and societal environment that can either act as enablers or barriers for communities coming together. Therefore, the points that refugees collect using their capacity, their common concern, and social capital are affected by barriers imposed on the community level. As you can see in this equation, once agency is greater than zero, we observe action. For example, the establishment of a refugee-led group or response. Next slide. So Jordan and Lebanon remains to be the two largest countries hosting the largest number of refugees per capita in the world. And at the same time, they are both not signatory on the 1951 Geneva Refugees Convention. Refugees have been living in those countries for decades, struggling their ways through non-permissive policies and fluctuating politics from one refugee group to another. This, as a result, engendered dire living conditions. Lebanon has one of the most enabling legal and regulatory environments for civil society in the Arab world. Its vibrant civil society usually assumes primary responses for service provision in domains where government fails to attend to the needs of its residents. Yet, Syrian, Palestinians, and other refugee populations residing in the country are denied the ability to create organizations on their own, and therefore are forced to rely on Lebanese allies to help register, protect, and represent their organization publicly before the state. Turkey, on the other hand, is a signatory on the 1951 Convention, and it treats refugees under two categories: of temporary protection for Syrians and international protection for other refugees. Same laws and regulations apply to both nationals and refugees when creating organizations. They can both register and operate their organizations. Okay, so given the restrictive environment of the host countries, RLOs emerge in different shapes and on a spectrum, varying from small-scale organizations and sometimes unregistered, registered up to well-established and visible registered organizations, local or transnational ones. This has been one of our main findings, where small and invisible RLOs, which are a majority in our mapping, do exist and can be effective, even though funders often don't consider them as potential civil society actors. Now to Mustafa.
Thank you, Farah. To understand the wide range of the spectrum and the politics of the host state towards RLOs introduced by Farah, we also identified the following factors that matter in the creation of RLOs within the range of the presented spectrum. The first and the most important one is the leadership. RLOs could be co-led, that is led by a refugee and a national person at the same time, or they could be operated under a national NGO's umbrella, or they could be fully refugee-led. The second factor is the legal status of the RLO. It could be registered abroad, or the transnational RLOs, or it could be registered in the host states as organizations or as companies, or they could be not registered at all. Another factor is their scope of work. Their scope of work could vary among humanitarian services, legal advocacy, religious or political, and cultural recreational. Size of RLO, another factor, it could vary from larger scale RLOs to medium and smaller scale RLOs, which is basically based on the mapping and the analysis we had done. Another factor, which is also important, and it's a determinant of the size of the RLO, is the funding sources. The funding could be from international donors, government funds, diaspora donations, and normal donations from people. Target group as the last factor is basically an RLO could be serving the host and refugee communities. They could be serving specific refugee groups, for example, youth or women, or they could be only targeting refugee communities. Next slide, please. One of our main objectives is to study how RLOs matter in their role within the refugee community, regardless of their size. We realize that there are two different impacts, to use the institutional jargon, on evaluating the role of RLOs. There is the measurable impact, which is mostly seen in well-established or medium-sized RLOs with a good rapport with the donors or funders. This kind of impact is evaluated in terms of numbers, such as number of reached beneficiaries, targeted goals, or budgets spent on the activities, and so on. Non-measurable impact, on the other hand, stems from activities that could not essentially be assessed in terms of numbers or in terms of money or budget, which is what we call in our work inhuman impact. Such impact is usually limited to the served community. It is extremely important to admit how valuable the presence of RLOs is and how vital their actions are among the refugee communities. Actions such as assembling and reassembling refugees at a community level, raising refugees' voices and needs to a wider audience through their agency, being a bonding factor among refugees and also between refugees and other individuals from the same culture and identity, and establishing linking bridges with the host community and the state. Additionally, it is because of the RLOs that a great network of social capital is accumulated in the refugee community, a network that has an invaluable impact on refugees' lives, though not measurable. Based on our analysis, we divide the agenda of RLOs through which their impact is realized into four. An RLO could be functioning only under one or more than one of these agendas. First is social protection, which is seen in many RLOs, that is raising awareness among the refugee communities through different mediums and social media and providing legal advocacy and support to the refugee communities. Second is service provision, which is perceived as the primary agenda of large and often transnational RLOs, such as SAMS in Jordan, Syrian Forum in Turkey, and Basma Zaytuna in Lebanon, that are providing education, health, employment, and livelihood support to the refugee communities in their respective countries. The third agenda of an RLO could be to recreate homeland, which is running specific activities to keep their culture and identity alive in the host countries. And the last factor is a space to act, which is providing training or sports activities to refugees, especially youth, or the kind of activities run by women-led RLOs to engage refugee women. Now, I would like to give the floor back to Dr. El-Abed to conclude this presentation. Farouk, back to you.
Thank you. Well, in conclusion, RLOs have always been in the Middle East in different shapes, structures, and serving different agendas. The politics of host countries and the funding politics of funders have shaped the visibility of the RLOs, their formality and their scope, agenda, and outreach. Registration, or the institutionalization of the refugee mobilization, appears to be imperative for securing funding and for setting the scope and work agenda and for scaling up, whether it is through training teams, whether it is through widening the scale of beneficiaries, or securing a proper registration. This consequently puts many of those which are accountable in their services to their beneficiaries in the shade. So we have those who are able to secure the funding, and on the other hand, those who are unable to secure the funding and therefore unable to register and therefore unable to be seen. That's why we decided to use the word visibility or invisibility. We divided our recommendations per actors, calling for host countries where it's clearly from all what we have seen, having permissive policies to include all refugees, regardless of nationality, as members of the civil society, and to give them the right to register their RLOs will enable these bodies to better serve their communities. In a region with long history of hosting refugees, having domestic laws will make a major difference in treating all refugees fairly with basic rights. To funders and donors, having permissive policies towards RLOs will enable RLOs to better access financial resources and hence to better serve their communities. We thus expect donors to advocate for a better ecosystem and flexible funding policies towards all RLOs, regardless of their shape. To humanitarian bodies, RLOs are active members in the civil society, and they need to be considered as partners in decision-making. They also need to be supported by big organizations through training or through partnership as a way to recognize their expertise and their localized role in support of refugees. To UNHCR, and thanks also for UNHCR for being with us today, to UNHCR who has been supporting, in light of the Global Refugee Compact, the self-reliance of RLOs, we call for them to advocate for policy change by the host states and by donors towards RLOs. And we summarize by certain recommendations for people like us, researchers, where we are calling researchers when designing projects based on refugee needs. It's very important and essential to bring in refugees to be part and parcel of the with their localized knowledge as major added value to our research work. So to bring them part as researchers and to involve them by sharing their ideas with us. This very much would make the difference in the way that we think about our approaches and the way we really address their needs. Thank you. I will hand over back to you, James.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, El-Abed, and to the team. That was very rich and very clear. And I'm always impressed to hear how you're able to take so much from the research and present it in 25 minutes. So many thanks to you. It's interesting that one of the taglines, one of the phrases that we've used throughout this research is moving from anecdote to evidence. You know, anecdotally, we've known so much of this, especially, as you say, those working in the region for decades. But to have this clearly presented as on the basis of the systematic research methodologies that you've employed really transforms the evidence base on which we work in thinking about policy and practice, which leads so well to the recommendations that you've presented. We've received a number of questions in the discussion box, and as we hear from the discussants, I encourage everyone in the audience. We're now up over 100 people in the audience, which is wonderful. Please use the Q&A function to pose your questions. I'm busily curating them here on a piece of paper. But we now have the real pleasure of hearing from two discussants and then a brief word from a colleague at UNHCR. So I introduced Yara at the beginning of the webinar, but Yara, let me pass the floor to you for your comments and reflections on this work.
Thank you, James, and good afternoon and good morning to others with us today. I'd like to first thank the organizers, LERRN and LEU Center for Lebanese Studies, for inviting me to be part of this very interesting webinar. And I'd also like to congratulate the research team led by Dr. El-Abed for a very well executed research study. So I'm personally very interested in the findings, given the scope of work that we also conduct here at the Refugee Research and Policy Program at the Institute, which I manage along with my team led by Watfa Najdi, who's also part of this study as well. Maybe let me start off with just a few reflections on the findings presented today, and mainly particularly those on Lebanon, while I also maybe share some of our own findings from a research study we've conducted alongside James from LERRN in a grant that we received from IDRC. So thank you to the researchers on the interesting findings. And they answer very important questions when related to refugee-led responses and the extent to which we can fill in some of those, they can fill in some of those gaps in terms of services and support to be provided. In terms of the patterns of RLO action, and this is I'm from the executive summary and could have probably been presented today as well. I definitely agree with the conditional factors that are mentioned. So be it the restrictive policies of the host country when related to the status of refugees and how to have these organizations being registered, the policy environment in the place, or maybe the lack of, and we refer to Lebanon especially, and the refugees' own awareness of these policies. And here I'd like to maybe add an additional potentially restrictive factor that we've come across, and it may be mentioned in the full report, but I just haven't seen it yet. So just to highlight it, and that is really the host community dynamics, which I believe have a big influence and are very important to consider. And similarly, so are the role of municipalities and sort of local actors and authorities in the regions where RLOs are working. So here I'd like to pose a question, and maybe we can get to it later as an answer from the research team. What best practices could you have seen or observed from your research on how to better really foster this positive relation between the RLOs on the ground and the local community? So is it maybe including local authorities, consulting them in the planning of activities, for example? And this also feeds into the question on funding and how to possibly support these RLOs by maybe including host communities in their activities for a better sort of, social cohesion, minimization of tension. So this might encourage probably further funding. On another related point, one of your main recommendations to the host communities was to have reliable access to legal status, and rightfully so, especially here in Lebanon, I would say. So here, maybe I could also highlight the role that municipalities could probably play in facilitating this process. So I'm definitely not encouraging or calling for, us to neglect the presence of the government. We can't do so, but I think there is an enhanced role that local authorities can play here, and we've extensively researched just this sort of concept here at the Institute, and I'm happy to discuss this further. And just a final note on the study here, your report, you mentioned that RLOs were found to have, of course, a lot of significant positive impact, and in many of the areas. And one of the main enablers here that was mentioned was connection to transnational networks. And here Watfa tackled it when she looked into the different layers. So here I'm interested to maybe also pick your brains as to what policy recommendations could you suggest to enhance this sort of connection? So what can we do for our RLOs to probably have this better transnational network in place? I'm going to jump just to a few notes, James, if you don't mind, here to a study that we had that's, that had RLOs as part of the case studies, and just maybe reflect on some similarities between the two studies. So our research project aimed to generate a nuanced understanding of how localized knowledge ecosystems on forces placement can be effective, policy impactful, and also sustainable. And we partnered with partners in East Africa and the Middle East, where we covered Kenya, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and Jordan. And we looked into how can these ecosystems produce, translate, and also use knowledge to affect change. And as one of our case studies here in Lebanon, it was in fact a refugee-led NGO. So we haven't published the report yet, so I won't mention the name for now, but I'm just going to reflect on maybe some of the findings that could be useful and helpful here to sort of supplement the project as well. So among the different functions, if you want, that were mentioned by Mustafa on the study today, an additional role that the RLO at hand here specifically played, and that's worth highlighting, was really knowledge production. Now, although it wasn't one of the only knowledge projects, were not necessarily the primary output of this RLO, but they conducted a lot of research on many topics. Data collection on M&E for ongoing projects and programs, as well as researching for advocacy purposes, for example, on the issue of return, and this is the sort of hot topic now in Lebanon, and to try and enhance the well-being and the protection of refugees and their own community. And similar to what was mentioned in the report at hand today, the relationship with the external factors played a very important and pivotal role in how much they could reach out to, how much this knowledge could actually reach out, and how likely is it to really influence policymakers. So there were various factors that contributed to this localization of the organization, including its nature as an RLO to start with, its strong relation and open communication with the communities it actually served. And a very important part here that that allowed this maybe RLO to succeed was its access to multiple funding sources. So here it had that sort of leeway in setting its own agenda and deciding its own program. But the RLO also showed something else that was very important, and that was its connection with local actors and local community. So this facilitated their access to the policymaking arena, where they managed to inform the discussion around very pertinent topics, such as the safe and voluntary return of Syrian refugees. And it's important to mention that international partners highlighted this importance. So part of their case study, it was an extensive case study where we spoke to donors and partners as well. And they highlighted the importance of this connection to the local community and encouraging them to partner up with a specific RLO. It was mentioned on several occasions that if they had a poor relation with this local, if you want, host community, the implementations of most of the projects weren't successful. Whereas on the other hand, if they had this sort of good communication and good understanding, success rates were much higher. There was a much better chance to sort of foster the social cohesion between the communities. So maybe from the great presentation today and some of the findings that we saw in our case study and the project as a whole, there are obviously a lot of enablers and barriers to be addressed when you're looking as to how can you impact or enhance, if you want, the impact of RLOs, whether in Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey, and how can they, within the space that they have, within the space that sometimes it's shrinking, sometimes it's wider, how can they better amplify the voices of the communities which they aim to serve? So I'd just like to thank you again for inviting me. I very, very much look forward to reading the full research report and collaborating further with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yara. And that point, and if I could ask you to post the link to that research you were discussing, if there's a link on IFI AUB's website, if you could post that, I think it speaks to the fact that there really has been such an accumulation of knowledge around these kinds of dynamics that we see in particular locations. So the more that we're able to bring that together as an evidence base is important. I note, for example, at the UNHCR Geneva level, this speaks to one of the questions in the boxes of work that's being done on a mapping exercise, and also the evidence base, the knowledge portal. The more that this research can be shared and brought into conversation with each other, I think the better. Also, your question about not just the role of RLOs, but RLOs within host community relations speaks to two questions in the chat box that we've had about public perception and the rise of anti-refugee sentiment. I think something that we'll get to in the discussion time. So I've made note of those, and we'll come to that in the discussion time. But now I'd like to call on Miriam Aslan to offer her comments, please. Miriam, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all the researchers and participants of this research. I think it is, as you said at the beginning, James, it is a very timely research. And I think it is extremely important to document the work of refugee-led organizations, to articulate the value they are adding to the sector, and to enable an environment where they can further strengthen and further apply their knowledge and experience. And without documentation, this is not going to be possible. It is very interesting to read the challenges of the refugee-led organizations, especially in terms of registration, but other barriers such as access to funding and maybe perceptions, relations, etc. And to acknowledge their diversity, the diversity and the diverse coverage also, and diverse activities that the refugees are involved in. It is very, very interesting to see that. But looking to the research has actually made me go back to one of the research the Turkish Refugee Council have done together with the development initiatives. And that was about the funding flows for refugee response in Turkey. And that's why it was very interesting to look at the challenges that are presented in the report. And I would ask the researchers how much they have looked into or are they planning to look into the inherent barriers that stem from the current ecosystem of humanitarian and development system itself, especially in accessing funding. Because our research, for example, in Turkey, and as your research says, that more refugee-led organizations in Turkey actually can register more than they can register in Lebanon or in Jordan. But when we look to funding flow for refugee response in Turkey, we see that 86% of the funding for the refugee response in 2019 and 2020 was directly given to international organizations. And the most of the funding that national organizations or refugee-led organizations received are indirect funding in Turkey. And of that total funding in these 2 years, only 5% of funding went to civil society in Turkey, for refugee-led and non-refugee, host community organizations. So most of the funding, and 14% went to national organizations that included government agencies as well. So it didn't even meet 25% of grand bargain in the total funding, calculating both refugee-led organizations, national organizations, and governmental institutions. So what I thought when I read in your research was, yes, registration is crucial for refugee-led organizations, because that's actually, in addition to what you are saying, I mean, providing the legal base at least for their finance and so on. But beyond that, I think it is important for the organizations to act in a safe environment, safe, without fear, and to feel that they are protected by law. And that's why their registration is very, very important, I think. However, I think it will be important to remember that registration is not in itself a mechanism that will guarantee finance to refugee-led organizations. As we see from national organizations who are all registered in Turkey, financing to international funding is not as easy as it sounds. No? And I think there are certain barriers that impacts both refugee-led and national host community organizations, and that in the funding environment that includes many things, level of funding that is very small, direct funding at least, but indirect funding as well, to host community and refugee organizations is small, short, legal. The funding is very short-term, inflexible funding, highly projectized, and the relationship with donors is really based on subcontracting relation, not strategic partnership. Overheads are inconsistent, etc. So funding to national or host community organizations and refugee-led organizations have many issues that all donors and intermediate organizations are already discussing through grand bargain and caucuses that are established in grand bargain, but we are nowhere near to resolve, at least for now. And partnerships, again, I think both refugee-led organizations and national organizations, the host community organizations, many times suffering from same thing, at least within the humanitarian development system. As I said, subcontracting, compliance-based relations instead of solidarity, and there is a big deficiency of trust. That is directed towards refugee-led and host community organizations. And that's why, as also Yara said, I think what will be very interesting to see is how we can build more solidarity between refugee-led organizations and host community organizations in society itself, how they can work with like-minded international organizations as well to create a more trustworthy environment where everybody can work as partners instead of subcontractor or instead of donors and intermediaries thinking that they are employing these organizations and they are employees of these organizations. And then also to think a little bit more about the already existing initiatives that of national organizations and refugee-led organizations to coexist together and to support communities as well to coexist together, and also to think together how can both refugee-led organizations and host community organizations and maybe even international organizations can think alternative ways of resourcing of their work and their initiatives. No? And I think, as I said, I think your research is very, very valuable. Certainly, it needs to be read parallel to other researches to complement each other, but also to lead us to go beyond typical narratives and to think a little bit more creatively about the real barriers that exist in the sector and how we deal with these barriers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam. Those are really critical points. And it's interesting, in the audience, we have one of the researchers of the East Africa Project, Uwezo, who did the research in Tanzania. We have Mark Akello and Pascal Zigashane, refugee leaders and researchers in the Kakuma and the Dadaab refugee camps in Kenya. And it's amazing how exactly these questions about political economy, the implementation of localization, but these questions of trust and power, how central they are in our thinking. And in a moment, we'll put in the chat box the link to a report by Asylum Access on the centrality of unpacking questions of power and trust within the kinds of relationships that we're addressing. So I'm very glad that you brought this onto the agenda. I'd like to move now to Ana Belen Arjona, who is a senior community-based protection officer with UNHCR's Regional Bureau for the Middle East and North Africa. Something that I would like to note is in the work that I do on these issues at a global level, what an important partner and ally in this work the community-based protection team is in DIP at the Geneva level. The task team that is currently underway between the partnership section and the community-based, co-led by the partnership section and the community-based protection team within DIP, along with the innovation team at UNHCR, is thinking about funding to refugee-led organizations, is thinking about the inclusion of individuals with lived experience of displacement and governance issues at a global level. So Ana Belen, I'm very pleased to welcome you, and I'd love to give you the floor for a minute or two just to give your initial reactions on this work at a regional level, before I'll then turn back to the team with some of the questions that have been raised. And I invite everyone to continue to put your questions in the Q&A box. Ana Belen, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, for this minute or two in this very important subject, in this very important event. I think I agree with all colleagues who have spoken that, of course, having a research that is conducted from civil society, working in Jordan and Lebanon, I mean, and also Turkey, but I'm covering mainly the MENA region, the Middle East and the North Africa, to some extent also Turkey. is very important for us. I mean, UNHCR is, as you know, an organization that is based out of the participation with refugees. So we have been, as you said now, developing this further or actualizing or updating those approaches. But certainly UNHCR has been always the focus of that. We have, for instance, the participatory assessment tool since 2006, and also AGD approaches has been in policy making from earlier time. We have updated this. For instance, we have the AGD policy that is updated to 2018. Just wanted to link that with our role in the grand bargain. So actually, UNHCR is one of the co-conveners. And is actually co-leading the few of the working stream of the work stream in the grand bargain. One of them being the humanitarian and development nexus, which is actually very much linked to this research, because it's talking about inclusion and how refugees and other displaced persons and stateless persons are actually included or being able to interact with the ongoing effort at the civil society. I think those were points that actually raised a lot my attention. It raised also a lot my attention, the fact of the focus on registration, and perhaps in my second intervention, if that is going to happen, I can explain a little bit more of all the strategies that we're putting together with civil society, with refugees and other displaced population and stateless peoples as well, to overcome this challenge. And of course, the partnership is happening either or not. This registration is happening. Of course, registration would also be helping. Just highlight before handing back to you that of course the funding is one of the types of support that some donors would provide, but partnership goes beyond funding. Partnership goes into actually engaging from the identification of risk to planning and implementing and monitoring together, and also partnership goes into exchanging the training materials and all of this. So I can later on share a couple of those initiatives that may help at the global and also at the regional level, like the MENA Community Protection Network that engages civil society and refugee-led organizations, or refugee, and we also work on other displacement populations. And I can also share the current mapping happening and the current engagement at the global and at the regional level. Just one last thing, if you allow me, because you said 1 or 2 minutes only, which is quite limited. Something that I would have liked to also look, I mean, as a follow-up of the very good research already, would be to look at how different groups of population, looking at women, girls, men, boys, people with disabilities, maybe those with diverse sexual orientation and gender identities, maybe those with different religions, are also able to form and to participate in different ways. Not only, I mean, refugee-led organization, but also in the different forms where participation takes place. This is, I think, this is also to look at the challenges that these different groups are facing. This is something that UNHCR is really focused on, and I could talk more about it in the second part of the intervention.
Thank you very much, Ana Belén. In a moment, we'll post in the chat box the link to what UNHCR is doing. The page of the task team globally. But Ana Belén, the point that you made about the mapping exercise that is underway, we're also keen to share that link, because one of the questions we were asked in the chat box is whether we can share the names and contact details of all of the organizations that were that participated in this study. And of course we can't for reasons of confidentiality and anonymity and the ethical parameters. But what we can do and what we will do is share the link to that mapping exercise and encourage those organizations that would like to it be included in that mapping, of course, that they include that detail. So Anna Belen, thank you to you, and thank you for what your colleagues are doing in the region and at a global level. I think UNHCR's leadership on this is really critical. So thank you. So back to the team. We have 25 minutes left. I'm going to push that to 28 because we started a little bit late. But Urub, Watfa, Mustafa, and Farah, we've received sort of 8 baskets of questions. And so what I'm going to do is let me start with sort of the 4 questions that we've heard the most, and I'll put those to you first, and then ask you to reply to that, and then with time we'll go to that second round of questions. And the first basket of questions was really methodological. So in doing this work, and given the participatory nature of the work, and given the level of engagement with community groups, with RLOs, with refugee researchers, there was a question about concerns that you experienced and how you addressed them around, the potential for bias or objectivity in the way that, including those closest to the phenomenon of displacement. Did that raise questions of bias perspective? Of course, there's a question that we all have positionality in this research, but, was there a question of bias, and how was that addressed? But then on the flip side of that, what were the ethics around a more inclusive participatory approach in terms of risk to individuals, and how were those addressed? So that's sort of methodology question 1. Methodology question 2 is really to try and dig a little bit deeper in terms of variation that you observed. There were a number of questions. Did you find variation within a country around nationality, around gender, around language spoken? And I know that you did, so it's a leading question. I'd invite you to share more in terms of, different nationalities that have been able to position themselves in different ways. And that leads to the third basket of questions, which was really, prompted by Miriam's point and some of what we heard from Anna Belen, is really around the political economy of this sector, and how you find, access to funding as being, a necessary but sufficient, or to what extent it has independent causal significance. Does the level of funding in and of itself have an impact? And what do we see in terms of trends of funding? It may link to the question of intersectionality in terms of, are there certain nationalities that are receiving more attention than others? But to Anna Belen's point about, it's beyond funding, yes, funding is important, but, how does funding as a variable, how does that measure up against some of the other determinants that we've seen? And then there's a last basket of questions, which I think has been the most visible in the Q&A box, and also from Yara's point, is really about, and the way that you have thought about refugee-led organizations, not just responding to the needs of refugees, but the communities around them. And so what you have observed in terms of refugee-led organizations, and empirically how they relate to host communities, but also the consequences of those. Does that lead to solidarity networks that we might sort of more fully understand? And then linked to that, and given the questions of public perception and media reporting in relation to the images, public perception around refugees, are there best practices that you've identified that you can share in terms of how the actions of refugee-led organizations related to these questions of relations? But then more generally, are there best practices that you have identified that you think are really important to highlight in terms of, lessons that we can take and try and apply elsewhere? So there you go. 4 questions to get you started. And very conveniently, there are 4 of you presenting the research on the screen. That was a happy accident. Urub, let me turn it to you for air traffic control. How would you like to take those 4 questions, and how would you like to divide up that reporting? If I can ask you to do that in about 8 or 10 minutes, that'll give us time to turn to more questions. I see that there are more questions still coming in. Urub, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for these questions, and much appreciative, really appreciation to the comments from Yara and from Miriam and from Annabelle. On methodology, I would like to hand over, I would like to respond to start with each question to give a little bit of a glimpse of an understanding, and then pass on to one of the field researchers, because they had like the country coordinators, because they had really the close relationship with the refugees. Our methodology, or one of the ethos in that we had really at CLS on one hand, but also in this research is to work closely with refugees in order for us to engage with them and think with them. So one of the issues that we had really to think about, especially in a country like Jordan, especially in a country like Lebanon, even in a country like Turkey, the 3 countries, we had issues. On one hand was the issue of mobility, like the country, like in Turkey. In a country like Lebanon, the issue was of accessibility. If I'm recruiting someone, for example, to lead the work in Tripoli, is this person able to go into an area in the south of Lebanon without being harassed or without being jeopardized, of his safety being jeopardized? And in a country like Jordan, it was the same thing, because in Jordan, there is, I'm very much building on the point that was mentioned earlier with the whole idea of inclusion. While a country like Jordan is claiming that there is this inclusion for Syrian refugees, but yet this is not for all the nationalities, one. Secondly, what could happen to a refugee being outside his zone, his area of residence? And what could happen to him or her working in a job that's closed? This is another very important point when we are recruiting refugees, jeopardizing their well-being. So what we decided to do to just come around this main constraint was to bring them on board and build with them on areas where they are based. So we sought their knowledge, their very localized knowledge, where they know very well the communities, and they know very well what they are telling us, because this is part of their entourage. So we made sure in the 3 countries that we did not recruit one refugee researcher. We recruited several refugee researchers who were involved with us in several spots and several districts. The issue of bias is quite important. Mustafa, I'd like to pass on the floor to you to tell us about your experience, because Mustafa as well not only needed the refugees to be supporting him in accessing the communities, but there was a language barrier that was very important for Mustafa to involve, to be close with the refugees, particularly the Syrians. So Mustafa, can you just give us your experience about the bias? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, or thank you. And thank you to our discussants, Miriam, Yara, and Annabelle, for raising these great points. Regarding the biasness and, of course, the subjectivity, I mean, the positionality, of course, it exists, but in our research, we try to minimize it as much as possible. And how we did that was basically, as Dr. El-Abed mentioned, was to whichever city or province we're going for. I'm talking about Turkey here, by the way. So we try to basically find a refugee from that community, which are basically from one side is a beneficiary of these RLOs, 1 or 2, or and this, on the other hand, they are basically a network and in connection with all other RLOs and other networks within that province. So we didn't try to limit our access to just one area of their basic reaching or their living, but to the whole province or to the whole city that they were. And yes, the language barrier here in Turkey. So I'm from Afghanistan originally, but we have the largest community of Syrian refugees, basically of something around 3.6 million people here in Turkey. How we overcome this challenge was, of course, we tried to find refugees, which again, it will come to the second point, that it was how beautiful we saw that the knowledge of refugees, how beautiful it is and how important it is. So we were able to find a really large pool of refugee researchers who are basically actively refugee in Turkey, but they were coming from a background of social sciences. They were coming from a background of, I don't know, interpretation. So apart from helping us and reaching the community, they helped us like in having a really good command of English, for example, which was very important for me to understand the community. And in some cases, they raised some questions in research, so they made us to change our approach, to change our perception of the community. So the other questions, I guess we're gonna go one by one. So back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa. On variation, in fact, I'm gonna pass on the floor to Farah to comment on that. But what happened, and I'm using the Jordan example, well, sadly, and we really need to admit this reality, the Syrian refugees in Jordan, and as it is this case in Turkey and in Lebanon, the three countries, the Syrians have been given this very extra privilege only because of the funding, the allocated funding by the international community. So all the other refugees have not been given that privilege in what may concern basic rights, what might concern education, and some of the rights in employment. Yet, when it comes to creating their own refugee-led organizations, it was forbidden for everyone. So there was no privilege at that point, because in a country like Jordan, same applies to Lebanon, a very vibrant country with its civil society bodies. When it comes to refugees, this is not permitted. So what we have managed to identify is that there has been and we analyzed it in our working paper that will be out quite soon, with the fact of agency. Refugees are active. Regardless of all these barriers that are imposed on them, they will be able to act, whether loudly or unloudly, or whether under the light or under the shade. And because of that, in a country like Jordan, we managed to trace, for example, the activism that has been happening amongst Sudanese and Somali, Yemeni, who have been trying to act and prove themselves, despite the fact that these two groups, Somali, Sudanese, and Sudanese and Yemeni, they do not have that very much power that has been given to the Syrians in what may concern registration, for example. In what may concern languages, indeed, we not only managed to identify nationalities, but for example, amongst Sudanese, we were able to identify subgroups, because we were talking about ethnic groups. So we were talking to people, the Sudanese community is a tribal community. So we were able to also trace tribal kind of RLOs created under the shade. So it's not only a Sudanese body, but it's a tribal body. That tells us very much that this agency enabled them to have this variation. Your question about, thank you very much, Annabelle, for highlighting the issue of gender. We did manage, and Watfa can elaborate on that, we did manage to trace several bodies that are working only on women, not only as a nationality, but refugee women with a particular nationality, with a particular ethnicity. I don't know if Farah, you have anything to add on this, and I'd like Watfa to take over to elaborate a little bit on this example of variation that we identified in Lebanon, but also to answer the issue of funding. I believe in the funding in Lebanon was so clear because we had this variety between those who partnered with nationals and those who did not partner with nationals. So Farah, is there anything for you to add on that?
Thank you, Aroub. Yes, what you have said is absolutely right. The Syrian refugees in particular, they have this policy towards them in Jordan that has been, let's say, better than the other refugee groups, which gave them like a better floor, or like a big floor for them to act more than other refugees. And for them living in the host community and living with vulnerable Jordanians within the host community gave them this reason to act and a reason to assemble with each other, just to act and have like their RLOs. And for the funding part, Aroub, if I may add, like we see the INGOs and the NGOs to like giving the funding because of the policies again to the Syrians more than other nationalities, which makes it also unfair for other nationalities and hinder them from creating their RLOs or to assemble and mobilize. Thank you.
Okay, so as we were discussing, yes, I mean, if I want to talk a bit about the variations or how do these variations, how are these variations created? It's because, and this is maybe might be one of the most particular advantages of RLOs is being able to identify community needs in a very collaborative and a very inclusive way. And this is one of the reasons that resulted in all of these variations. And this is why in Lebanon, for example, we saw refugee-led organizations that are specifically work on women issues because they are often left behind or they are marginalized or are do not receive the attention that they require in their communities. But moving forward, to talk about more about the funding and how sometimes the accessibility to funding and the networking that the refugee-led organizations were able to create, the networks, the social capital that they had, very much affected their access to funding and to other opportunities. So in many cases, we saw refugee-led organizations who have active partnerships with local organizations, with national organizations or NGOs, or with international organizations, and that kind of facilitated their access to funding. However, we also, in our research, highlighted how this might also somehow result in a particular filtering of a particular refugee voice, and this is something that we should be very careful about. And because sometimes while this was a very big advantage to some, it was a major hindrance for others. And this was also the same case whenever we're talking about RLO's relationship with the community. So while being present in a very restrictive host environment, encouraged reaching out and creating networks and relationships and capitalizing on the social capital with nationals in the host countries proved to be very effective and very promising. Actually, as Yara mentioned, this could actually be a very good way to kind of enhance social cohesion, to capitalize on solidarity, on relationships between people, between refugees and host communities. While this was the case in some instances, in others, unfortunately, where refugees lacked these networks, it was it created a major limitation for them to be established and to reach out. And this is where I think, yes, one of our recommendations was to be more inclusive of refugee-led organizations and to forge more partnerships and more relationships that can highlight their existent work, but also help take it to the next level and advance it even further.
Yeah, thank you very much, Watfa. And Urub, if I may, we have about 5 minutes left. And so what I'd like to do is ask sort of two more sort of overarching questions, but to pose these to the 4 members of the research team as a way of offering some final reflections before we move to conclusion. In the chat we've had, or in the Q&A box, we've had a number of questions about, you know, as a social scientist, what I would describe as sort of agency questions, what refugees are able to do with funding, with etc., and structure questions, right? The policy environment, the political opportunity structure within which refugee-led organizations function, and that regardless of how much agency refugees demonstrate, structure plays a role. So my first sort of concluding question is, how do you see this balance between the agency of refugees, refugee-led organizations, in light of the structures within which they function. And if we have recommendations of what needs to change, is it one or the other? Is it both? And then my last question is a very direct one. If you could have one more topic that you would research, if you could draft your next research that builds from this, what do you think the next research question is that should be asked? We have a number of scholars and emerging scholars on the line. So really to get your, just what would be the title of the next research that you would do building from this work? So let me pass it to you to offer just some final thoughts on those 2 points, and then I'll say a couple of words to conclude our webinar. Urub, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you, James. Absolutely, thanks very much. In fact, with answering your question concerning agency and structure, I believe this is a very much of a good occasion also to answer the question that was raised earlier on, what is the best practices? What are the best practices that we're recommending? I would start with a point that, which I believe we have mentioned it several times in our work, is that it's about time for states, for humanitarian bodies, for donors, to see that and to put under their radar the work that's been done by the community. And this is one of the things that we did on our work, is that when the community are coming together, and one of the things that we analyzed also in the word of impact is that this coming together is making much, in all of our interviews, everyone expressed highly valued the way that agency comes together amongst people and bring them together and serve their own needs that are so varied. So in my view, it is very important to widen our scope and lens of looking at refugees beyond only focusing on who is registered and who's receiving the funding, to what is the role that is being done by the really active small organizations. One, what is the kind of echo impact that they are doing at multi-level? Do not limit ourselves only to the word of service provision, because I believe the recreation of a homeland is something that's so essential when it comes not only to a national, but also to an ethnic group. So this is another element that we really are calling for. Thirdly, and here we come to the best practices, is how beautiful it would be when we are doing the merge between the agency and the structure. So to answer your question, James, what do we really need to go for? I believe one, again, answering a question that was raised, is that can we really change the ecosystem? We cannot change ecosystem. We lobby, we advocate, but what we can do, we can very much advocate big organizations, RLOs that are registered, local NGOs, to create this umbrella in order to host these little NGO RLOs, small RLOs, appreciating, valuing more their localized knowledge. And by doing that, this is very much of an opportunity that's giving to very limited localized knowledge to come out, to blossom, and to widen the scale of services to wider communities.
Yeah.
I would also question the word of self-reliance. And here I would also answer your question. If we really want to put a question, putting a big question is that, what do we really mean? We have today UNHCR with us, and we're having, again, we're talking about the grand bargain, and we're going for another session of the Global Compact end of this year. So it is really worth stopping at the word self-reliance, unpacking it. How do we really apply it? The self-reliance is not that the fact that I'm able to go out of my home and to bring in my neighbor to talk to his needs. Self-reliance is how I am able to do that without having the fear. The concept of not fearing, which Miriam raised it at the very beginning, how important it is for us to create the safety net that is well valued by the host state on one hand, but also valued by the donors and by the international community and supported by them. So this is another element where I believe we really need to do more work of understanding the self-reliance.
Yeah, no, thank you, Urub. I think that's critical. I'd like to give a last word to Mustafa, Watfa, and Farah before we conclude. But Urub, Popcorn, to whom do we go next?
I'm gonna pass on to Watfa. She's very alert and ready, so go ahead.
I mean, just briefly, I think Aruba already covered most of that question, and not to keep anyone any longer. I mean, it is very critical what Aruba just highlighted, and what is even more critical is now what while we celebrate refugee-led organizations and the actions that they are currently taking and the impact that they have in their communities and host countries, it is very critical that we do not over-romanticize the agency of refugees. They do still have to withstand major restrictions, and they still live in a very critical environment, and this is something that we should not overlook. And with that, I would like to give it over to Mustafa, I think.
Thank you so much, Watfa and Urup. I guess Dr. El-Abed just covered all the questions. Just the last point, which of course we can talk about it for hours, is about the public perception. That was a question that was raised. So it's something that basically we are still working on, is how we can change it. It's difficult, but the only practice from my perspective could be that how we can give this perception to the public that refugees, they are not a burden to the community. They bring knowledge, they bring capital, they bring social capital, and they bring, in some cases, a flow of international funds to the country. So, and this could be concluded in the fact that refugees could not be a burden if they are basically managed well in not only in the Middle East, in every country. And yeah, I guess that's that I can talk about. Farah?
Thank you, Mustafa. I don't think that there is much to add, but I think that amplifying the voice of the RLOs, especially the invisible ones, and to show their positive impact in the society, what matters most. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Farah. And I think that's such an important point on which to end the webinar, is this question of evidence that makes visible, that brings into discourse that which we've known anecdotally. And the team has done a tremendous job in the research, and thank you for that. As I said from the beginning, the full report will be available by the end of the month. If you're registered for the webinar, you'll receive a link to the recording and the report from the webinar, which will also include the link to the full report. So we're very excited to share that. But for now, let me just say a sincere thank you to Urub and the team, to Watfa, Mustafa, and Farah, not only for your presentation today, but for the research and the work that you've done, which has just been exceptional. A big thank you, Yara, to you, to Miriam, and also to Anna Belen for coming in with your thoughts and the depth with which that you've engaged with this work, but also the way that you've connected it to other pieces of work that are happening, to realize that this is an opportunity to keep weaving together this knowledge base that we have, and with the belief that knowledge can bring about change. My sincere thanks to more than 100 participants that joined us from around the world. And just to say to those of you on the screen, colleagues joining from, I counted 5 continents that joined us today, which is a real testament to the power of this kind of platform. I say thank you, shukran, merci to the interpreters who provided really valuable support in making this possible. And a sincere thank you to the entire team with LERRN, to Nadia, to Richard, to Beatrice, to Iram, to our note takers, Rachel, Nadia, everyone that has been involved in not only hosting this webinar, but in all of the work in promoting it, and now the work in editing the results, Jaroksun as well. So for everyone who joined us, you will soon receive a link to a survey. Please take time to complete that, and you will receive a link to the report by email in due course. So with that, let me say thank you to everyone for joining. Wherever you're joining us from, stay well and take good care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.